Carthage must be destroyed. Guided by this maxim, Roman legionaries literally erased from the face of the earth a vast city, the capital of a great maritime power whose ships had plied the waters of the Mediterranean for centuries and dared to venture far out into the Atlantic Ocean. In the blaze of the conflagration, the temple of Baal Hammon also perished. Within it lay astonishing trophies, gorilla skins brought back by the Carthaginian navigator Hanno from somewhere on the coast of equatorial Africa, along with a stone stele bearing the text of the Periplus of Hanno, describing one of the most thrilling voyages ever undertaken by ancient mariners. Unlike Carthage, the text of the Periplus of Hanno did not perish. It has come down to us in a Greek translation, apparently made as early as the 5th century BC. This document differs significantly from typical Greek periploi. Beginning as a rather dry, prosaic report, it gradually transforms into a vivid, artistic narrative reminiscent of an adventure novel. It lacks precise geographical coordinates and is almost useless for identifying the locations visited by the Carthaginian sailors. However, the Periplus is rich in picturesque, sometimes even terrifying details. The Periplus of Hanno, king of the Carthaginians, concerning the Libyan lands lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And the Carthaginians decided to dispatch Hanno on a voyage beyond the Pillars of Hercules to found Libo-Phoenician settlements. And he set out accompanied by 60 50-oared ships with 30,000 men and women and provisions and other supplies. 30,000 people on 60 ships? What a colossal scale! And even if this number is considered exaggerated by some scholars, it cannot be denied that Hanno's expedition was indeed an outstanding undertaking. Its primary goal was political, to establish a foothold on the Atlantic coast of Africa. To this end, Hanno was tasked with founding colonies beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Carthaginians sought to outmaneuver their maritime competitors. At that time, Carthage's main rival in the western Mediterranean was Massalia, modern-day Marseille, a Greek colony on the southern coast of present-day France. Shortly before Hanno's voyage, the Massaliot sailor Euthymenes sailed along the Atlantic coast of Africa and reached a large river teeming with crocodiles, which he mistook for the source of the Nile. Modern scholars believe this was the Senegal River. Now Hanno had not only to surpass his rival's record, but also to secure Carthage's control over the sea routes along West Africa. At various points along the coast, Hanno founded new colonies, leaving behind some people and ships at each, so that by the time he reached the southernmost point of his journey, their numbers had significantly dwindled. The African coast beyond the Pillars of Hercules was well known to the Carthaginians for several hundred kilometers. Entering the Atlantic, they founded the first city, Thymiatarium, where the Moroccan city of Media now stands, after 2 days of sailing. Then they proceeded further and built a temple to the sea deity in the area of Cap Cantin. Rounding the cape, the Carthaginians saw a large lake on the shore, not far from the sea and thickly overgrown with reeds. Elephants and numerous other animals grazed here. The lake stretched along the shore for a full day's journey. After passing it, Hanno founded 5 more colonies on the coast and finally reached the river Lexus, Wed Dra, where the travelers were met by the friendly tribes of the Lixatai. Staying with them as friends for some time and taking several guides aboard, the Carthaginians sailed south again along the desolate shores of the Sahara. At the mouth of a large river called Tretons by the locals lay a large lake with islands. Near its southern end rose mountains inhabited by wild people dressed in animal skins. Landing here proved impossible. The savages drove the Carthaginians away from the shore by throwing stones. Further along, Hanno's route lay another large, wide river, teeming with crocodiles and hippopotami, undoubtedly the Senegal. From here, the Carthaginians sailed for 12 days, skirting the mainland until they arrived in the land of the Ethiopians, that is, black Africans, whose language was incomprehensible even to the guides. The Ethiopians proved very timid. Spotting the ships, they fled into the forests. The Carthaginians landed at the foot of large forested mountains, examining with interest the strange trees with fragrant trunks. Weighing anchor again, the expedition found itself 2 days later in an enormous bay with flat, plain-like shore. At night, lights were visible on both shores from the ships. After taking on fresh water here, Hanno led his ships onward. 5 days later, the expedition reached a large gulf. The guides explained it was called the Western Horn. Within this gulf were several islands, each with saltwater lakes. The islands were densely forested, making it impossible to see anything within the thickets by day. However, when night fell, the jungle lit up with dozens of fires. The sounds of flutes, timbrels, and loud cries came from somewhere. Perhaps it was simply an African celebration, but the abundance of fires and the strange music in the night frightened the Carthaginians. They immediately left the island. Their path then led past a land abundant with spices. Yet landing here was impossible. There was terrible heat. The shore blazed with fire, and enormous fiery streams poured directly into the sea. The sight of this fiery element filled the Carthaginians with awe. 4 days later, they entered a veritable hell. At night, they saw the land ablaze from their ships. Above the raging tongues of flame rose a tall pillar of fire. It seemed to reach the stars. When dawn broke, the fiery phantoms retreated, and what had appeared as a pillar of fire at night revealed itself in daylight as an immense mountain spewing flame and smoke. The Lixitai guides explained it was called Theon Ochema, the chariot of the gods. 3 days later, Hanno's ships arrived at a gulf called the Southern Horn. Deep within it was an island inhabited by wild people with bodies covered in hair. The guides called them gorillas. The Carthaginians managed to capture 3 female gorillas, but they bit and scratched desperately, making it impossible to bring them aboard. They had to be killed. Their skins were removed. Later, expedition members triumphantly displayed them in Carthage. From the shores of the gorilla island, Hanno turned back. "We sailed no further. Our provisions ran short," he concludes. The periplus of Hanno has sparked extensive debate in modern scholarship, including questions about its authenticity. Some argued that the periplus is not an authentic report by a Carthaginian mariner, but a forgery, albeit ancient, composed by some Greek author who used the name of the mysterious Hanno for a purely literary work. Proponents of this theory believed the language of the periplus was too correct and poetic, betraying the hand of a Hellenic writer. Furthermore, they argued, there is no concrete archaeological evidence of Carthaginian penetration along the African coast south of Mogador Island. And Hanno simply could not have returned from beyond Cape Bojador, as overcoming headwinds without proper navigational instruments and with only a square, Latin sail was impossible at that time. However, these objections proved unfounded. It is known that for long overseas expeditions, the Carthaginians used pentaconters, large 50-oared ships built of wood and lined internally with lead sheets. These were primarily rowing vessels and therefore did not depend, or depended very little, on wind direction. They could sail along the African coast indefinitely in any direction, south or north. Philological analysis of the periplus text showed that many Greek turns of phrase were merely translations from Phoenician, Punic. The information in the periplus of Hanno about the flora and fauna of the African coast generally corresponds to actual conditions and differs from the typical Greek notions of the impossibility of life in those regions of Africa. Another disputed question is the date of Hanno's voyage. Some scholars believed it occurred in the second half of the 6th century BC, or even at the end of the 7th, beginning of the 5th century. However, modern archaeological data indicate that the first traces of Carthaginian presence in northwest Africa appear at the turn of the 6th-5th centuries, and it is difficult not to connect this with Hanno's activity. The most debated question: the extent of Hanno's voyage. The mariner himself, in his report, after a fairly clear description of the initial stage of the journey, recounts the subsequent voyage rather vaguely, seemingly even deliberately vaguely, stating only that he reached a mountain called the Chariot of the Gods and the Southern Horn Gulf. The Chariot of the Gods has been linked to Cape Verde, Mount Kakulima in Guinea, and Mount Cameroon. Be that as it may, all these points lie south of the mouth of the Senegal, reached earlier by the Massalayat sailor Euthymenes. This likely explains the clarity of the first part of the periplus. Since the route to the Senegal estuary was already known, there was no need to conceal it. But the subsequent route, that was definitely worth hiding. The historicity of Hanno is also beyond doubt. He was one of the ruling Maganid dynasty in Carthage, possibly the eldest of the brothers, grandsons of the legendary Mago who held power in Carthage in the first half of the 5th century. This is why the periplus calls him the king of the Carthaginians. And certainly, only a very high-ranking individual could lead such a large-scale enterprise involving 30,000 people. Essentially, it was the wholesale resettlement of a portion of Carthage's citizens. Trust in Hanno's account grew as scholars accumulated more information about West Africa. In the mid-19th century, a previously unknown species of ape, the gorilla, was discovered in Gabon. But these were precisely the creatures described by the Carthaginian sailor who, it appears, reached the Gulf of Guinea, the Southern Horn. And the role of the Chariot of the Gods could well be claimed by Mount Cameroon. Its height is 4 kilometers. For a long time, it was considered extinct, but when its crater unexpectedly erupted in 1909, setting the entire coast ablaze, many scholars unconditionally accepted Hanno's testimony. The next eruption of Cameroon in 1922 was even more colossal. If this version is correct, then Hanno must be recognized as one of the greatest navigators of antiquity. He became the first representative of Mediterranean peoples to penetrate tropical Africa from the west. It can be assumed that upon entering the depths of the Gulf of Guinea and